basement script. Full draft. She was 16 years old. She worked the morning shift at the Granite Falls Red Owl grocery store on Saturdays, bagged groceries with both hands, and always double-bagged the milk without being told. On the morning of October 22, 1993, she walked out the front door of her house on Birch Street and never came back, and the Chippewa County Sheriff's Office told her mother, within 72 hours, that Mara Ellison had run away. That is not a story about a teenager who chose to disappear. That is a story about a system that looked at a 16-year-old girl from a single-parent household and decided, without evidence and without effort, that her absence was her own fault. And it would take 32 years, the retirement of the detective who made that decision, and a basement wall that had been quietly holding the truth since the autumn of 1993 to give Mara Ellison what was taken from her. But to understand what was in that basement, you have to go back to Granite Falls. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Mara was. Granite Falls, Minnesota, is a small city on the Yellow Medicine River in the southwestern part of the state, about 100 miles from the South Dakota border. In the fall of 1993, it was a community of roughly 3,000 people. Farm supply stores and a grain elevator and a movie rental place on Main Street that had a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising new releases every Tuesday. The river valley turned gold in October, and the smell of the corn harvest came down off the fields in the evenings and settled over the town like something you couldn't quite name, but would recognize for the rest of your life. People watched out for each other's kids. They knew which houses had dogs and which had trampolines, and whose mother worked nights. It was the kind of place where a child's absence would have been impossible to miss. Mara Ellison had grown up on Birch Street, 3 blocks from the river, in a 2-bedroom house with yellow curtains her mother Carol had sewn herself the summer Mara was born. Carol worked double shifts as an LPN at the Yellow Medicine County Hospital, had raised Mara on her own since Mara was 4, and had built a life that was modest and carefully arranged and exactly what it needed to be. Mara was a junior at Granite Falls High School, where she took advanced art and kept a sketchbook that her art teacher, a woman named Mrs. Halverson, said was unlike anything she had seen from a student in 20 years of teaching. She was 16 years old. She had a Saturday shift at the Red Owl that started at 6 and ended at noon, and she gave half her paychecks to Carol for the household and saved the other half in a coffee can on the shelf in her room. She was saving for the application fees at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. She was $200 short. She had a habit of leaving a pencil sketch, small, quick, precise, tucked under her mother's coffee mug on weekday mornings before Carol woke up. A bird on a fence, a coffee cup with steam, a window with a curtain moving. Carol kept every one of them. The man who lived in the house directly next door at 744 Birch Street was named Gerald Penter. He was 44 years old, a Chippewa County school bus driver who had run the same morning route for 11 years. He knew every child on his bus by name. Parents on Birch Street and the surrounding blocks trusted him completely, which is to say they trusted him the way communities trust the people who become invisible through familiarity. Not because they had examined the trust, but because it had never been questioned. On the morning of October 21st, 1993, the day before she disappeared, Mara left a sketch under Carol's coffee mug. It was a drawing of their front porch, looking out toward the street. Carol kept it, the way she kept all of them. She did not know it would be the last one. Carol Ellison called Granite Falls police at 6:40 p.m. On Saturday, October 23, 1993, the second day Mara had been missing. She had not called the first night because Mara had, twice before in the past year, stayed over at her friend Kelsey Briard's house without remembering to call. On both occasions, Carol had found her there in the morning, embarrassed and apologetic. Carol waited until Saturday afternoon before calling Kelsey. Kelsey had not seen Mara since Thursday at school. Carol called the police at 6:40 p.m. The officer who took the call asked Carol how old Mara was. 16. He asked if there had been any trouble at home. Carol said no. He asked if Mara had a boyfriend. Carol said not that she knew of. The officer noted the report and told Carol that teenagers sometimes needed space and that most runaways returned within 72 hours. By Monday morning, October 25th, Mara had not returned. The detective assigned was a 15-year veteran of the Chippewa County Sheriff's Office named Lou Brandt. He was methodical, thorough in most respects, and operating under a set of assumptions about 16-year-old girls from single-parent households that he would spend the next 30 years examining. He interviewed Carol. He interviewed Kelsey Briard and 2 other friends. He spoke briefly with Mara's art teacher, who told him that Mara had never once mentioned wanting to leave Granite Falls and who seemed, to Brandt's notation in the file, credible and not alarmed. He did not interview Gerald Penter. The neighbor had been present, visible, normal. He had expressed concern when Carol mentioned Mara was missing, in the way that neighbors express concern on front porches in October when the cold is coming down. Lou Brandt noted in his file that the neighborhood had been canvassed and that no one reported anything unusual. He classified the case as a voluntary runaway on November 3, 1993, 12 days after Mara disappeared. The clothing she had been wearing on October 22nd, a denim jacket, a gray sweatshirt, jeans, was never found. Her coffee can of savings was still on the shelf in her room. Her sketchbook was still on her desk. Her coat was still on the hook by the front door. The silver ring her grandmother had given her on her 14th birthday, the one with the small blue stone she wore every day, was not on her dresser, which meant she had been wearing it when she left. Which was the one detail that Carol Ellison repeated at every conversation with every investigator for 32 years. She had that ring on. She would not have left without that ring. None of this changed the classification. Carol called the sheriff's office every week for 3 years, then monthly, then on Mara's birthday in January and on October 22nd, and whenever something in the news made it feel possible that someone might finally listen. Lou Brandt retired from the Chippewa County Sheriff's Office in 2011, 18 years after Mara Ellison disappeared. He had worked more than 400 cases in his career. He remembered most of them with the orderly precision of a man who had trained himself to keep work at a professional distance. The Ellison case was one of 2 cases he could not keep at a distance. He had known by the end of his 2nd year away from the job that the runaway classification had been wrong. He did not know what it should have been instead. But he knew that a girl who left her savings and her sketchbook and her coat had not chosen to leave. He kept a personal copy of the case file, the way some men keep an old photograph, not because looking at it helped, but because he couldn't stop. He drove to Carol Ellison's house on Birch Street on a Wednesday in April 2014, 3 years into his retirement. He sat at her kitchen table and told her he was sorry. He did not offer excuses. He told her he had been wrong and that the classification had been wrong, and that he intended to spend whatever time and energy he had left on finding out what had actually happened to Mara. Carol listened to him without interrupting. She let him finish. Then she said, "I know. I've been waiting for someone to say that for 21 years. She gave him her folder, 12 years of notes, clippings, and every letter she had written and never sent. He sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours, going through it. He drove home and started over. By 2015, Brandt had developed a renewed focus on Gerald Penter through a combination of factors the original investigation had never assembled. Penter had moved out of Granite Falls in January 1994, 3 months after Mara disappeared. He had sold 744 Birch Street to a young couple who renovated the kitchen, raised their children there, and sold it again in 2005. The basement had not been substantially altered since the original construction. The north wall had been paneled sometime in the early 1980s. Nobody had looked behind the paneling. By 2018, Brandt had located Gerald Penter living in Winona, Minnesota, 160 miles away. He had been there since 2002. He had no criminal record. He drove a pickup truck and had a garden and attended a Lutheran church. Brandt brought what he had to the Chippewa County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Coordinator in March 2019. He was told there was insufficient physical evidence to justify a formal investigation. He kept going anyway. Every case on this channel is built from weeks of research, verifying documents, tracking down records, piecing together the lives of people who were owed more than silence. If you want to keep this work going, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Mara. In the fall of 2024, the rental property at 714 Birch Street was purchased by a contractor named Steve Vickery, who intended to flip it. The renovation scope included the basement, which had a crumbling poured concrete floor and walls that had been partially finished with wood paneling sometime in the early 1980s. When Vickery's crew began removing the paneling on the north wall on September 18, 2024, they found a section of wall that had been repaired recently, relative to the rest, with mismatched mortar and a slightly different aggregate. The repair covered an area approximately 2 feet by 3 feet, at about knee height from the floor. Steve Vickery had done enough renovations to know what a wall that had been opened and resealed looked like. He called the Chippewa County Sheriff's Office that afternoon. The detective who received the call was a 10-year veteran named Angela Moser. She drove to 714 Birch Street, walked the basement, examined the north wall, and stood there for a moment in the September cold that came up through the concrete. The repair was visible once you knew to look, the mortar slightly lighter, the aggregate a different texture from the surrounding wall, applied with less care than the original construction, as if by someone who needed it done quickly and never expected it would be examined. She called the evidence technician. She called her supervisor. Then she called the county records office and asked for the ownership history of the property going back 40 years. The name Gerald Penter appeared as owner from 1981 to January 1994. She went back to her office and pulled the open missing persons files for Chippewa County. Mara Ellison's file had been reclassified from runaway to active missing persons in 2019 following a petition by Carol Ellison and a formal letter from retired Detective Lou Brandt, which Moser had read when she first joined the cold case rotation. She remembered the address. She remembered the name. She called Lou Brandt from the parking lot of the sheriff's office at 4:17 p.m. On September 18, 2024, he was 73 years old and living in Montevideo, 15 minutes from Granite Falls. She said, "We found something at the Birch Street house." He said, "I'll be there in the morning." He was there before 7. Forensic examination of the cavity behind the repaired section of the north basement wall began on September 20, 2024. The work was conducted by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Crime Scene Unit under the direction of Agent Diane Cole, with Detective Moser and Lou Brandt present as county liaison and civilian consultant, respectively. The cavity measured approximately 24 inches wide by 36 inches deep. The material recovered from within it included fabric consistent with early 1990s textile manufacturing, a gray sweatshirt, partially deteriorated, a denim jacket, and a silver ring with a small blue stone. Angela Moser photographed the ring before it was bagged. She sent the image to Carol Ellison at 6:45 p.m. on September 21st. Carol was 68 years old and living in the same house on Birch Street, where she had lived since before Mara was born. She looked at the photograph on her phone. She set the phone down on the kitchen table. She picked it up again and looked at it one more time to be sure. She was sure. Biological material recovered from the site was submitted for DNA analysis using forensic genealogy, a method that uploads crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases, the same websites where ordinary people trace their family history, and works backward through shared relatives to identify an unknown contributor. The result came back in 6 weeks. The profile matched samples provided by 2 of Gerald Penter's first cousins, who had uploaded their DNA to a genealogy website years earlier, without any knowledge of what it would one day help establish. The result pointed unambiguously to Gerald Penter. Gerald Penter had lived in Winona for 22 years and had become, in that time, exactly what he appeared to be in Granite Falls: a quiet, helpful, unremarkable presence in a community that had no reason to look closely at him. He volunteered occasionally at his church's food shelf. He maintained his yard. He attended his nephew's high school graduation in 2019 and was photographed smiling in the backyard afterward with a paper plate of potato salad in his hand. He had been, for 31 years, a man the world was prepared to trust without examining. In October 1993, he had been Mara Ellison's next-door neighbor. He had known her name since she was a child. He had watched her grow up through the fence between their yards. He had a key to the gate between their properties, lent to him years earlier by Carol Ellison for reasons of ordinary neighborly convenience that she would spend the rest of her life reconstructing in her mind. He had been, by every visible measure, a safe and familiar presence in a child's life, from the time she was old enough to understand what a neighbor was. He had been present at 714 Birch Street on October 22, 1993. What happened between Gerald Penter and Mara Ellison in those hours is documented in the warrant affidavit filed by Detective Angela Moser in November 2024. The details are part of the court record. What matters here is what the basement wall established beyond argument: that Mara Ellison did not run away, that she had been there, in that house, the whole time. That children had ridden in Gerald Penter's school bus for years after 1993 while their parents waved from driveways. That the community had walked past 744 Birch Street for 31 years without knowing what the north wall held. Gerald Penter was arrested at his home in Winona, Minnesota on November 14, 2024. He was 75 years old. He came to the door without his coat and looked at the officers for a long moment. He said nothing. He stepped outside. The wind came off the river, and he stood in it without moving. He was charged with first-degree murder. He entered a not guilty plea. Trial was scheduled for 2026. Lou Brandt was present at the Chippewa County Courthouse when the charges were filed. He did not speak to the press. He sat in the gallery and watched the proceedings, and then drove back to Montevideo and called Carol Ellison from his driveway and told her what had happened. She already knew. Angela Moser had called her first. But she wanted to hear it from him too. She wanted to hear the voice of the man who had gotten it wrong and had spent 11 years trying to get it right. She said, "You kept going." That mattered. He said he wasn't sure it was enough. She said, "It was enough for me." There is a drawing of a front porch that Carol Ellison kept for 32 years. It is small, done in pencil on notebook paper, slightly creased at the corners from being unfolded and refolded over many years. It shows the view from inside, looking out through the front door at the yard and the street beyond. The screen door with the handle, the step, the strip of sidewalk, the elm tree that is still there. Mara drew it on October 21st, 1993, the morning before she disappeared, and tucked it under her mother's coffee mug before Carol woke up. Carol still has it in the folder with all the others. It is the last one. She does not put it away. Mara Ellison was 16 years old. She had a Saturday shift and a coffee can of savings and an art teacher who remembered her for 20 years. She left small, precise drawings under her mother's mug because she understood, in the particular way that some 16-year-olds understand things, that love is best shown in the details. She had a future in front of her that was specific and earned and completely her own. The case of Mara Ellison has prompted renewed calls from advocacy organizations in Minnesota for mandatory review of missing persons cases involving minors classified as voluntary runaways before 2000, with particular attention to cases where the classifying investigator had no documented evidence of voluntary departure. The Minnesota Missing and Unidentified Persons Clearinghouse cited the Ellison case in a 2025 policy brief, recommending that the runaway classification require a higher evidentiary threshold. Whether that change becomes law is a question still being answered in St. Paul. What is not a question is this. A retired detective who spent 30 years living with a wrong decision went back and did the work he should have done in 1993. It did not undo what happened. It did not return 32 years to Carol Ellison or to Mara. But it changed what the basement wall had to say. And that changed everything. Justice is not always clean. Sometimes it is a man in his 70s standing in a driveway in the cold, with no coat and nothing left to say. Sometimes it is a retired detective sitting in a parking lot at 4 in the afternoon, making a phone call he had been trying to make for 11 years. Sometimes it arrives decades late, and still, somehow, matters before you leave. Do you think the runaway classification contributed directly to Mara's case going unsolved for 32 years? And should there be accountability for investigators who make that determination without evidence? Lou Brandt spent years trying to correct a mistake he made when he was still on the force. Does that change how you think about his role in this story? And what does it say about a community when someone can live next door to a family for decades, attend church, volunteer, and still be capable of what Gerald Penter did? Justice found Mara Ellison after 32 years because her mother never stopped, and because a man who got it wrong the first time refused to let that be the end of the story. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe and stay with us. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.